Hello, welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit special. We are going to be watching footage from Green Chapel 2025's semi-final bout between Scott Bradley and Chris Yang, but that's not what makes it special. What makes it special is the fact that we have two completely different camera angles from opposite sides of the ring. And what this allows us to do is do a little bit of a reverse shot on certain exchanges to help illuminate partly what makes judging so difficult in HEMA, what makes certain exchanges so difficult to judge, and more specifically, how you need to be able to trust your fellow line judges when it comes to deliberation on events that happened in an exchange, because sometimes the things that you see are really only half the picture. So we're going to watch all 10 of these exchanges, and we're going to have the flip shot on a lot of them to help show off what really happened and how sometimes you need to see the other half in order to really understand the exchange itself. So for our first exchange, we have a fairly clear one. Scott initiates from the right with a big thrust that doesn't quite make it there. Chris Yang parries and riposts with a counter left Zverkow that definitely lands both visibly and audibly, at which point Scott follows up with a remise of his own, another left Zverkow that also lands both visibly and audibly to the body, but looks a little bit flat from this angle. However, when we look at the reverse angle, everything looks a little bit different. That thrust is no longer completely obvious that it didn't quite make it to its target. It's still pretty clear when you're watching it in slow motion, but you can imagine that if you were a judge at the time and all you had was that fraction of a second to figure out what went on, you may think that that thrust landed to the hands, or maybe it was a cut to the hands, or maybe it just got pushed off of a shoulder very, very quickly. The counter left Zverev is still obvious from this camera angle, and most importantly, or maybe not most importantly, Scott Bradley's follow-up left Zverev looks significantly less flat here. That's of course because from this camera angle, you can see the gap and the space between his sword and Chris Yang's body, which means you can see it visibly land and then pull off. And while on the other camera angle, that entire time it was just kind of sitting in front of the torso, making you think that the entire breadth of the strike was flat, whereas it was only flat for a certain point after it had already made contact. Now, this next exchange is significantly less clear, especially from this camera angle, and it's not just because of the judge standing in the way. What happens here is that Chris Yang is the one to initiate this time with a cut that looks like it might have gotten onto the shoulder, but it also looks mostly parried, at which point both Chris and Scott throw their counter Zverkows. However, both of them are very stuffed up due to the fact that they are both very, very close to each other and their hands are slamming into one another, meaning that they can't really get the good rotation. It does look like from this angle that Scott does manage to get his blade onto the arm of Chris, but it's with the strong and it's not with a lot of great rotation and again, a whole lot of stuffing. However, from this position, Chris seems to shut down a little bit, obviously thinking that he might have landed his Zverev or that the exchange was going to be over, and Scott capitalizes on this mistake and starts Zverking some more. He throws a right Zverev, which you can't really see whether or not it lands well, and then another left Zverev that comes all the way around and looks like it makes it through to the shoulder of Chris. But of course, we have to now look at the reverse angle, and in the reverse angle, things are very, very different. The initial cut that Chris Yang throws looks a lot more obviously a valid hit because on this side of the camera, you can see the right side of Scott's body and you can see that blade clearly make contact onto his upper shoulder in a missed parry. But even if you don't want to count that one because it is a little bound up and it might have gotten a little bit parried, the follow-up Zverev from both people seems to pretty clearly land here, whereas from the reverse angle, you can't really see whether or not Chris's follow-up Zverkow lands. On this side, you can pretty clearly see it land, making the next two Zverkows that Scott Bradley throws sort of irrelevant. However, what is relevant is the fact that the judges did not call halt at this time. And what that means is that Scott is the one who comes away with the points here, not necessarily because he got the most valid strikes, but because the judges, who were very indecisive about whether or not they saw something, didn't say halt until after Scott had thrown his final technique. And this is a very important lesson to learn for a lot of people in the realm of tournaments. You always have to fence to the halt. Judges miss things, and while it was probably painfully obvious to both Scott and Chris that hits were landed before they called halt, the simple fact of the matter is that if you don't fence until the halt, if you don't fence until a judge sees something, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to get smacked, and you're going to be standing there, and you're not going to be doing anything. Now, this next exchange is somewhat similar to the ones that we've been seeing so far, and that's a little bit of a theme throughout the fight itself. But this one is messy in a very particular way, and again, very much plays into the reverse shot kind of angle that we have here, because you get to see completely different perspectives on a key thing that happened during this exchange. So once again, Scott initiates with a little bit of a flicking cut. Whether it was a shield how or a thrust or a cut, doesn't really matter. It gets parried by Chris, who immediately throws another left Zverkow. Now the issue here is that Scott goes to try to parry this left Zverkow by going into a right side hanging parry. And on this camera angle, with the back of the judge facing us, it's completely impossible to tell whether or not that parry really lands. You can try to use the audio cues and listen for whether or not you hear blade hit plastic, blade hit padding, or blade hit blade. And the reality is that you kind of hear a little bit of both. At the exact same time, Scott, who is going into this hanging parry, looks like he gets his tip really, really low, but isn't really trying to throw any kind of follow-up attack. At which point, after he supposedly gets the parry, he throws another follow-up left Zverkow, which definitely does land, at which point Chris follows it up with another cheeky little hand shot, mostly just to even it out. So, looking at this perspective, it looks a little bit like a double, depending on whether or not you think Chris landed that initial left Zverkow. On the reverse angle, everything looks completely different once again. Scott's little shield how cutting thrust no longer looks like it's anywhere near its target, and the left Zverkow from Chris absolutely lands onto the back of the shoulder and even wraps around a little bit onto the back of Scott for that initial counter riposte, making it significantly less obscure for the people on this side of the room what happened here. At which point Scott follows up with his left Zverkow again. He definitely does land it, and Chris Yang definitely does get that follow-up. But you can see how from the first perspective, this was a pretty unclear exchange and a very difficult one to judge, but from another person's perspective, it was kind of clear as day. So we're getting towards the end of the fight, but the exchanges aren't really getting any less messy. In this particular one, Scott starts to initiate his forward momentum, does a kind of Krumpau thing, I think trying to just close off a zone. Chris utilizes this opportunity to throw a shield house straight down the pipe, and Scott has to try to get his sword up high enough to parry it. And from this camera angle, it looks like Scott got the parry. You don't really see any meaningful bend or any meaningful percussiveness from Chris's hit towards the head, and assuming then that it got parried, Scott's follow-up techniques are 100% valid. He gets in real close, stuffs any kind of ability for Chris to maneuver his sword, and zverks him what looks like 2 or maybe even 3 times without any real response. But of course, when we look at the reverse angle, there is a very important detail that you don't get to see from that other angle, and that is the fact that Chris not only looks like he lands that initial shield how, that interrupting shield how, but it also looks like it might have actually stuck into Scott's face and gotten a little bit of a thrust off. From this angle, not only can you see that there is a lot more contact being made with the blade of Chris onto Scott's head, but you can see there is a moment right in the frame by frame where the sword bends a pretty decent amount at the end of the blade and then bounces off, not quite getting enough purchase onto the not sticky metal mesh of Scott's mask before just completely getting sent off. It also makes a lot more sense as to why Chris did not use any follow-up techniques, because of course when you land a thrust or only partially land a thrust, your blade is then immediately going to sail past your opponent, and with your tip so far past where you wanted it to be, there's nothing you can really do to kind of pull out and throw any kind of follow-up cuts, and there's certainly nothing you can do to try to reassert your tip in order to get another thrust off. So Scott just had free reign of that initial area after the initial thrust to just, Zverkow as many times as he wanted. So the important thing to take away here, and this is probably one of the few times I'm going to talk about the actual tactics of this fight, is that all of Scott's initial actions, whenever they got parried, were followed up by a left Zverkow, and that's obviously something that should be happening here all the time. But in the few interactions where we saw a different kind of technique and a different kind of exchange play out, Scott was getting the most out of any interaction where he was taking advantage of the fact that halt was not getting called and frankly, that is again something that he needs to do. So if you ever are in this situation, what you need to understand is that sometimes in certain situations, there are techniques that you can throw that even if they land, put you in a spot where you can't continue to fence. And this is one of the issues that I also kind of have with continuous fencing rule sets. When you throw a thrust and it does or does not land, you are in a position now where you basically can't pull out of it anymore. You have committed and you either landed your thrust or you didn't, and now your opponent has the ability to throw as many cuts as they want while you attempt to recover. The exact same time, though, if you always throw cuts as your initiating action, they are going to get missed because sometimes they're going to get mostly parried or even somewhat parried, and people aren't going to be able to see whenever cuts are able to blow through guards and just get those little nicking shots onto your arm or shoulders. And this again plays into the fact that when you have two different camera angles, you also simultaneously have two different judges with two different perspectives on what they saw happen. And so if there's anything that I would try to have people take away from this is that in virtually every tournament you're going to go to, you're going to have two opposing line judges. And again, they're always going to have different perspectives. But if you're a director, one of the things that you need to make sure of is to keep in mind when you're watching a fight, which judge had vision on which side of the fencers. Because in situations like this, when you want to create a little powwow, pull everyone together and find out what happened, you have to keep in mind, okay, this person on my left saw the left side of the body. Maybe they had a good perspective on whether or not the thrust landed. This person on my right side who saw the right side of the opponent's body, maybe they had a good perspective on whether or not the cut was flat. The person over here physically can't see that. The person over here physically can. You have to keep that in mind when you're a director, because otherwise you're going to start taking information that isn't necessarily wrong and isn't necessarily a lie, but is going to cloud your ability to judge and exchange, and of course is directly going to contradict what you saw, because you, regardless of whether or not you're in this perfect tri-pointed, perspective, are still going to have things that you're unable to see. And if you don't trust your judges and you don't understand what they can and can't do, then you're going to cloud your opinion with information that's irrelevant. You're going to put your own opinion over the opinions of your line judges who have better information than you do, and you're going to be a bad director. So this is what you can learn from this. And of course, if you want to see more of this, I will be doing the finals match from this fight next week probably, or maybe a little bit after that, hopefully with some more reverse shot footage.